We all go through different chapters in our lives, some stranger than others. Welcome to Strange Chapters, where we bring you true stories of the strange, the macabre, the paranormal, and the supernatural. So sit back, relax, and let's get to this week's featured author and their stories. Hey everybody, welcome back to Strange Chapters. Thank you so much for listening. I am your host and narrator, Eric Freeman Sims, and today we bring you 3 stories from Eve S. Evans' book, Real Ghost Stories, Haunted Murder Houses, and you can find all of her books on Amazon Kindle and wherever fine books are sold. Again, that's Eve S. Evans. She has over 50 books, so go check her out. Most of her books are nonfiction and give you real stories, and she does some true crime, does paranormal, and all that good stuff, so go check her out and grab some of her books. Let's sit back, relax, and get strange. Story 1, Flats Murder. I have never been the biggest fan of my birthday. It always made me feel silly, all the fanfare and attention. But when Joey told me he was throwing a party for me at the Matt Squee Flats house, I couldn't say no. The place was everything a college kid could have dreamed of. The converted garage was furnished with a ping pong table, a fully stocked beer fridge, and a bunch of cozy couches, perfect for crashing on late at night after the festivities. The walls were covered in murals, and the closet was jam-packed with every board game I'd ever heard of. I may not have loved birthdays, but I loved my friends, and I loved a party at the Matt Squee Flats house. I applied another coat of mascara and took a look down at my watch. If I left now, I'd be early, but Joey would be expecting that. My mother always told me that if I was early, I was on time, and if I was on time, I was late. I grabbed my keys and headed out the door into the dark winter night. As I walked across the quad, I felt my body going tense. Things have been happening lately, bad things to young girls. We've been advised during a somber floor meeting to move in pairs and stay vigilant, lest we end up like Amber and Kelly. The 2 were sorority sisters who had gone missing during a night out. The next day, Kelly stumbled into the police station, so badly bruised and beaten she was hardly recognizable. She told a harrowing tale of escaping the clutches of a sadistic psychopath who had killed her friend and almost Kelly too. I try to stay away from crime news, never feeling the desire to learn the gory details, but the case was being covered so heavily in my little college town that it was inescapable. It was a perfect headline, the brutal slaying of a beautiful sorority sister and the brave survival of her heroic friend. The press ate it up. What's more, the man had yet to be caught. Despite Kelly's help and the police's best efforts, it seemed that he had disappeared into thin air. Until he decided to start toying with him again. Though it couldn't be proven that it was him, it was the only thing that made sense. Who else would remove Amber's headstone in some sort of twisted joke, while the soil she was buried beneath was still loose? Who else would call into the local radio station and describe in detail the look on her face in her last moments? The man was a sicko, and he was on the loose in our little college town. I shivered at the thought and quickened my pace to the car, trying to put the horrible events of the past week out of my mind. Finally, I reached my car, ducked in, locked the doors, and relaxed with a sigh. No more thoughts of Amber or Kelly or serial killers, I decided. It was my birthday after all. I turned up the ABBA song on the radio and pulled out of the parking lot onto the main road, singing along as I did. The drive to Joey's place wasn't a short one, but it was along a usually empty stretch of road, surrounded by farmland. Frankly, it was easy to speed. As I sped along the road doing at least 10 over the speed limit, I watched as the space between the houses grew further and further apart, and the streetlights became more infrequent. Ditches lined the street, and I veered toward the middle of the road, fearing the idea of sliding into one. As I approached the old schoolhouse, my sign to take a right, "Don't Fear the Reaper," begins to play on the radio. I look down to adjust the volume, and when I look up, what I see makes me slam on the brakes and veer the steering wheel sharply left. There, barefoot and blonde, stood a woman of about my age on the side of the road. In my haste and distracted state, I nearly plowed her down. Catching my breath, I look out the passenger side window to the girl, my body pumping with adrenaline. What in the world had she been doing out here in the middle of the night without shoes on? When I looked in the spot she had been standing, by the right side ditch in front of the old schoolhouse, she was gone. I searched feverishly for where she might have gone, craning my neck in every direction. Though it was dark, the land was flat and empty. It seemed impossible that she simply disappeared. It was no doubt dangerous to be running around late at night with a killer on the loose. I took a deep breath and tried to shake it off. I started back along my route and in a few minutes arrived at Joey's house. I let myself in without knocking, my heart still thumping in my chest. Joey was attempting to hang streamers, and when I barreled through the door, he almost lost his balance atop the chair he stood. "Jesus, you scared me." I grabbed a beer from the fridge and cracked it open, throwing myself into one of the plush couches. "Oh, I mean, happy birthday," he said. "I'll tell you something scary," I replied, and then recounted to him the tale of the vanishing barefoot woman in the road. He listened intently, his mouth a straight line. When I finished the story, he furrowed his brow. "You know, that's not far from where it happened." My blood went cold. He didn't have to specify what he meant. I knew. We all knew. Somewhere not too far from that schoolhouse, our classmate had been murdered and another had to fight for her life. Just then, Janet and Mary barged through the door. They greeted me with a flurry of hugs and well wishes, but I could see an odd look in their eyes. They grabbed themselves beers, and silence fell across the room. I cleared my throat and spoke. "Are you guys okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." They exchanged looks and shuffled their feet uncomfortably. "Promise you won't think we're crazy if we told you what we saw?" Mary was usually level-headed, but now she sounded frightened. I felt my pulse quicken and looked at Janet. "I can't speak for Mary, but I know what I saw," she said, taking a long drink of her beer. I could hear my heart thumping in my ears. One second she was there, just standing by the side of the road in front of the old schoolhouse. The next second, it was like she disappeared into thin air. "Who?" I asked, my heart now a quick percussion and my skin tingling with a prick of sweat. I already knew the answer. "The woman," Mary replied, "the barefoot one with blonde hair. What the hell is she doing out there in the middle of the night?" I think about that night a lot, the night of my birthday in Masquee Flats at Joey's old house, but I couldn't tell you what happened after that. The realization of what we'd seen weighed heavy on us that night, and ever since we've all had a certain caution when it comes to the paranormal. I never found out exactly where Amber had died, though we know it's near that old schoolhouse, but if I had to guess, I'd say it was the ditch on the right side of the road, where she finally met her end. One fact did come to light that nearly knocked the wind out of me the first time I read it in the paper. It was a tiny blurb, perhaps unimportant to anyone but myself and my friends, but to me it was all the confirmation I needed to know what we saw on that long stretch of empty road. The night Amber's body was found, she was barefoot. Story 2. Dolly, Dearest. Every neighborhood has that one house, the creepy one, shrouded in mystery with a dark past and a looming presence. The type of place dumb kids like to sneak into on a dare. In my neighborhood, it was the Monroe house, and it was right across the street. What's more, I was the dumb kid who tried to sneak in. Before I was born, the Monroe family lived there. They seemed like any other on the block and cared for their home with pride. The couple had a young son and 2 Dobermans. They lived a normal suburban existence for most of their lives. That's why it was such a shock to all the neighbors when Mrs. Monroe came home to find Mr. Monroe swinging from an attic rafter. People claim he even hung the dogs too, and while no one but the police know for sure, my grandma said she never saw those Dobermans again after that day. The horror didn't stop there, unfortunately. When I was 15, living with my mother and sister in my grandmother's house, right across the street from the Monroe mansion, the son of the family murdered his only surviving parent. He went out back to the shed and grabbed a hammer, then snuck up behind her while she was reading the morning paper and smashed it into her head over a dozen times. Then he dug a hole in the backyard and buried her. That's where she stayed for almost a year, as the local news ran missing person reports on her weekly. They said when they finally dragged the murdered son out in handcuffs, he was wearing his mother's old nightie and panties, but that could just be a rumor invented by some bored housewives. In any case, the house earned a reputation. Despite the comically low asking price, it couldn't sell and was eventually boarded up and condemned. It became a challenge for the local teens to break in and see how long they could last before they got too spooked to stay. It was silly, I know, but that's what kids do. And one muggy summer evening, we decided to test our nerves by breaking into the Monroe mansion ourselves. 4 of us, myself included, had spent the evening biking around the cul-de-sac. When evening slipped into night, we dropped our bikes on my front lawn, and my grandma brought out glasses of her famous lemonade. We sipped them gratefully as we stared up at the house. As it grew darker, there appeared to be a dim light flickering in the attic window. We watched, not sure if our eyes were betraying us, as the light grew brighter. We exchanged glances, and without a second thought, my friend Carlos jumped to his feet. "It's a sign, gang," he said, smiling. "Tonight is the night." Carlos had been begging us all summer to sneak into the house, but we'd always come up with an excuse. The twins exchanged a nervous glance. They had strict parents who instilled them with the fear of everything, from men in vans to bumblebees. Their matching sets of blue eyes were filled with worry, but they both had a crush on Carlos and didn't want to see him chicken, so they stood to join him nervously. I sighed and agreed as well, and we made our way across the street. The boards on the cellar door had been ripped away by kids who came before us. We squabbled for a moment about who would go first, with Carlos finally volunteering to lead. With only the beam of a single flashlight to illuminate the way, we pushed open the door, its rusted hinges screaming in protest, and entered the dusty old home. We were immediately hit by a rancid smell of something old and rotten. The twins covered their pert noses with disgust as we scrambled for the stairs, gagging. "What the hell is that?" I asked, my eyes watering from the putrid stink. "Probably some cat," Carlos responded. "Crawled in here and died, or something." The smell dissipated as we climbed stairs, but their dirty old house was ominous to say the least. Something just felt wrong about the place, and I could tell my friend sensed it too. Just then, my foot hit something in the dark. I reached down blindly and wrapped my hand around it, raising it to my face to realize it was a tiny porcelain doll. I slipped it into my pocket and caught up to my friends, who were gingerly examining what it must have once been the living room. Suddenly, Carlos swung around, blinding us with the flashlight, and screamed, "Boo!" The twins shrieked and then laughed, the sound echoing throughout the empty structure. I didn't want to be here anymore, I suddenly realized. It felt like we were being watched, and my friends' flippant attitudes were making me nervous. I opened my mouth to speak when suddenly one of the twins let out a blood-curdling scream. I thought for a moment that she too was joking, but then I saw her tear through the dark toward the front door, her sister close behind. I didn't hesitate to follow them, and Carlos was on my heels. When we reached the steel-boarded front door, I threw the entire weight of my body against it, splintering the old wood. I pushed it open, my hands wrapping around a splinter-filled slice of wood that tore clean off as I ran, panting across the street. When we made it back to my front door, the twins were both teary-eyed and shaking. The one who first ran told me she thought she heard the sound of a woman moaning, then felt something grab her leg. I was skeptical, assuring myself it was only their paranoia taking over, but we vowed not to go back either way. The twins left, and Carlos and I were alone on my front porch. That's when I showed him the items I'd taken from the house. When he saw them, his face lit up with a devilish grin. "That's perfect for the seance," he said, licking his lips. I rolled my eyes but could think of nothing better to do than to humor him, so we made our way into the garage, where he laid down the items and began to prepare for the ritual. He forced me to hold hands and chant, chiding me when I laughed, but unsurprisingly nothing happened. He left a few hours later, disappointed, and I hid the doll and wood chip in the corner of the garage, covered in a tarp so my grandma wouldn't see it. If she had known we were hunting for ghosts in the old Monroe house and tried to summon evil spirits in her old garage, there'd be hell to pay. What happened next, however, I cannot explain. The following day after school, I was greeted by my mother, standing at the door, her arms folded. "Why did you leave all those tools lying around the garage?" she asked indignantly. "I didn't," I responded. "I haven't even touched them." She asked me who else could have made the mess, but I didn't have an answer. She sent me over to clean it up either way, and I begrudgingly obliged. When I opened the door to the garage, the tools were scattered around the room. In the center of the mess sat the doll. I silently cursed my sister for reminding me of that creepy old thing and making a mess I was now forced to clean. It had to have been her, I was sure of it, yet she denied it vehemently. I didn't believe her, that is, until it happened again. I was home alone, sick with the flu, and staying out of school. I went into the garage in search of ibuprofen, and when I opened the door, the mess had returned, and once again the doll sat in the middle of the room, its black, soulless eyes fixed on me. I'd seen the state of the garage this morning after my family had left, and it was perfectly clean. I couldn't believe what I was looking at, and the sight made my toes curl. I quickly cleaned up the mess, shoving the doll in the tackle box and closing it tight, piling it under one of the overflowing shelves where it stayed for many, many years. We eventually moved out of my grandma's house and away from the Monroe mansion. Slowly, the memory of that night and the scary little porcelain doll faded away, until yesterday. My grandma recently passed away, and my mother was in charge of dealing with her things. She stopped by with a cardboard box and told me she had a gift for me, something I left at her house that I might want. The second she pulled it from the box, the same sickening fear I felt that night crept over me. It was the doll, its empty eyes and smooth porcelain face as eerie as ever. "Where did you find that?" I asked. My mother looked down and began to stroke its hair. I had locked that thing away and hoped I'd never had to think of it again, but here it was, having found its way back to me. My mother sighed. "It was right next to her," she said, her voice soft, "in Grandma's bed when she passed away." Story 3. Neighbors. My mother didn't know when she signed the lease that the apartment complex had a reputation. How could she? From the outside, it looked like any other building, 4 stories with a terrace on each floor, roomy and freshly painted units, and shockingly affordable rent. I'm sure it had felt like a steal. She was freshly divorced after all and wanted to give us a real chance to start over. She was proud of our new apartment, and we were excited about the future. That's before we knew what kind of things happened there. It was 2 months since we had officially moved in, and I had just started to settle in. I had an east-facing room with a big closet that I had furnished with a large bed and a desk at which to do schoolwork. My brother had the room next to me, a massive improvement to sharing a cramped bedroom like we were forced to in the last place. Mom even had a lovely master bedroom with an ensuite bathroom. On paper, everything was perfect, but something about the place felt off from the start. I tried to brush it off, calling it growing pains, but then things started to happen. I sat at my desk plugging away through some math homework when I heard a noise. I turned down the classical music always played while I studied and listened harder. It sounded like it was coming from the unit above me. It was a whisper, the scratchy, hoarse whispering of an old woman. I was confused. I'd never heard a peep from the apartment above. Were the walls really so thin that I could hear this old woman's voice, even at the decibel of a whisper? I tried to continue working, turning the music up, but the sounds only got louder. While the words were indistinguishable, the tone was panicked. It was unmistakable, the voice of an older woman, and she sounded distressed. Eventually, it was too much to bear. I slammed my textbook shut, feeling electric, and stormed out onto the shared patio space. The patio was empty except for a boy who looked to be about my age. I marched over and plopped myself down in the chair next to him, registering the look of shock across his dark features. "You ever have problems with your neighbors?" I asked, frustratingly picking at the threads on my sweater. "Yeah," he replied, "when they come to interrupt my alone time." I looked up with embarrassment and saw that he was smiling playfully. "Just kidding." I sighed with relief and introduced myself. "I'm Saya." "Damon," he said, then sighed himself. "When it comes to the neighbors, as long as they're alive, they're better than most." "What do you mean?" I asked, a feeling of unease creeping into my bones. "You know about the history of this place, right?" Damon asked. I shook my head no. "Murders, suicides, overdoses. More people have died in the apartment building than I can count." My fingers tingled and my pulse quickened. "So what are you saying?" I asked. "What does this have to do with some old lady whispering too loud in the upstairs unit?" Damon looked at me strangely. "There is no old woman upstairs. They always put the senior tenants on the first floor in case the elevator goes out. That's been the common practice since that one woman." "But that's impossible," I insisted. "I heard an old lady whispering right above me." Damon shook his head slowly. "You're going to have to be faced with a lot more impossibilities if you plan on sticking around here," Damon said. "A place filled with so much death. I mean, all these people are bound to leave something behind when they go. Are you talking about ghosts?" I couldn't help but to smirk. We were too old for these silly little stories. Yet something inside me felt cold. Damon caught a glimpse of my skeptical expression. "I didn't believe them either until I moved here," he said. "But this building, well, it'll make you a believer." With that, he rose from his chair and headed back towards his apartment door with a polite wave. "Goodbye, Saya, and good luck." That night, I couldn't fall asleep. I did my best to put his words out of my mind, but when the sun began to peek over the horizon, I had still not caught a wink of sleep. I pulled out my computer and Googled my address. Sure enough, just as he said, there was an article in the local paper listing the exorbitant number of deaths. My heart pounded as I read through them. A man overdosing on heroin in apartment 23B, a woman shooting her abusive husband in 34F, a girl my age stabbed by a masked intruder right downstairs. With each horror listed before me, I felt the pit in my stomach grow larger and larger until I read one that made my skin crawl. In 19D, the unit right above us, an old woman had died. She had been left unattended by her family for months at a time. They didn't find her body until it started to smell. When they opened the door, they saw her lying there, her house cats gorging themselves on the soft flesh of her eyeballs. The thought of it made me physically ill. I shut the computer as fast as I could, vowing to forget what I read and never speak of it again. This was our home now. My mother was happy and our lease was long term. I didn't believe in ghosts anyway, right? I kept my mouth shut to my mother and brother and hoped the neighbors would do the same, but I never did get another good night's sleep. We stayed there an entire year. Strange things did seem to happen. Items left one place and found in another, mysterious bumps in the night and doors that opened on their own. Slowly, the realization dawned on all of us that perhaps there really was something unexplainable within those walls. Now we live in a house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't until we moved that I realized the massive relief it was to free ourselves from that building and all its sadness. I remember waving goodbye to Damon from the car as we sped away, the weight of the world slowly lifting off my shoulders. However, it was what happened the week before we left that made us all reconsider the existence of ghosts. My brother and his friend Jack had been out on the terrace tossing a ball around as the sun fell behind the horizon. In the dark, they could hardly make out the shape of the girl who slowly approached them. Turning halfway around to take a quick glance, Jack shouted to the girl, who assumed was his little sister, that he'd be in momentarily. She just stayed right where she was, staring. Rolling his eyes, Jack yelled that, all right, he was coming. He began to walk toward her, still facing my brother as he wished him a good night. My brother, on the other hand, could not look away from the little girl, and as his eyes adjusted to the dark, he realized this wasn't Jack's sister. In fact, this wasn't a normal little girl at all. Where her legs should have been, there was nothing. She simply floated, suspended impossibly in midair, her guts spilling from the base of her disembodied torso. Her expression was empty and pained, and her fingers clutched at the space where the rest of her body should have been. My brother later told me that the rhythmic, sickening plop of thick, sticky blood dripping from her massive wound haunts him to this day. Seeing the look of horror on my brother's face, Jack wheeled around to see what truly stood before him. In unison, the two boys both shrieked bloody murder and ran back to their respective units as fast as possible. Later, as I stroked his hair to calm him down, my brother looked up at me and asked me something, his face pale and sickly with fear. "Who was that, Saya? What was that?" While I wasn't sure I had an answer for the second question, I unfortunately did for the first. I recalled that singular search I made of this address the night I first met Damon, and he told me about the history of those horrible, haunted apartments. The one that had stuck with me the most, the murder that made me sickest to my stomach, had been of the little girl. Just below the balcony on the street, her abusive alcoholic father had taken her life. As she waited by the curb to welcome him home one night, he drunkenly plowed right into her little body. She died almost instantly, and the scene was one of absolute carnage. A woman interviewed for the paper said she looked on in horror as the girl bled out. Her quote for the paper makes me shudder to this day. "He cut her right in half," she said, "his own little girl." All right, everybody. That is all for this episode. Those three stories, Flats Murder, Dolly, Dearest, and Neighbors, the three stories from Eve S. Evans, Real Ghost Stories, Haunted Murder Houses. Go check out the rest of this book and more of her books on Amazon, Kindle, and wherever fine books are sold. And if you have Kindle Unlimited, a lot of her books are free to read. So go check them out and come back and listen to next week's episode. And in the meantime, y'all stay safe out there and stay strange.